They said Delta 6 had gone dark. No pings. No data streams. Just silence. A research base orbiting the collapsed remains of a long-dead star known only for its eerie radio emissions and irregular gravitational pulses. Delta 6 was a listening post, a sentinel watching the edges of known space. For 17 years, it sent back streams of deep space audio, tracking radiation signatures from beyond the charted stars. But 3 days ago, every sensor went blind. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. So Command sent the Aegis Veil, a Black Ops survey vessel outfitted for deep vacuum retrieval, with me, Commander Aaron Voss, at the helm. I wasn't the first choice. I was the last available. I remember stepping onto the observation deck as we dropped out of hyperspace. No alarms. No flickering lights. Delta 6 hung motionless like a tomb suspended in nothing. The base hadn't moved, not an inch, but there was no sign of life. No crew. No shuttle drift. Even the maintenance drones had frozen in place like statues lost in time. That's not how things die in space. When something fails, it spirals. It burns. It collides. But Delta 6 looked, paused. Like someone had pressed mute on reality itself. My crew was minimal. Just 5 specialists. But the silence began affecting us within the first hour. I could feel it crawling under the skin like a frequency just below hearing. A pressure in the bones. Our communications officer, Tal, described it best. It's not that the station's quiet, it's that it's listening. He laughed when he said it, but there was no humor in his eyes. Something about that place made you want to whisper. We docked on the east port. The airlock responded. Still functional. Lights flickered alive, but nothing greeted us inside. The base's AI standard on all installations should have spoken. Announced protocols. Recognized my clearance. Instead, we were met with dead speakers and cold corridors. We proceeded to the command hub. I took point. Signs of chaos were strangely absent. No blast doors engaged. No emergency beacons. No evidence of distress. But the crew logs had been manually wiped, every last one. That kind of deletion requires 5 separate authorizations, and even then it leaves metadata behind. Here, there was nothing. No trace. It was as if the base had never been inhabited at all. Then we reached the listening core, the heart of Delta 6. And that's when things changed. The room was lit in pulses, the overheads synced to a slow heartbeat rhythm. Someone or something had rerouted the power flow. On every wall, hand-scrawled messages were etched into the metal panels as if carved with makeshift tools. Not in English. Not in any known language. The symbols pulsed under the red lights as if absorbing energy. And then I heard it. Not through my ears, but through my thoughts. A voice. Low. Mechanical. Broken like static, yet deliberate. Stay. We listen. We remember. I reached for my helmet mic to report back, but I couldn't move. None of us could. Tal dropped to his knees. Lyra started whispering numbers. Moreau bled from his nose. And in that moment, the base spoke through silence, through gravity itself. It showed us things buried in light, wrapped in screams too ancient for sound. Whatever had reached Delta 6 hadn't come from the stars. It had come through the void between the stars. And it had waited for someone to arrive. We should have left. Burned the docking bridge, fired retros, and vanished into the black. But whatever was inside Delta 6. It didn't just paralyze us, it anchored us. There was no official term for it. The medtechs back home might have called it neurolock or suggestive paralysis, but it wasn't chemical or neural. It was intentional. Like a gaze from something with no eyes and attention that crushed thought and fed on doubt. I remember the silence cracking like ice. First in my own thoughts, then in Lyra's voice. She was sobbing, repeating one phrase in a whisper that shook the walls. It's under the skin. It's not in the walls. It's in us now. I ordered a tactical withdrawal. We moved slow, every step like dragging iron chains. Moreau collapsed halfway down the corridor. Veins bulging, eyes dilated. His breath raspy like he was drowning in dry air. We carried him. The base seemed to shift around us. Corridors subtly altering, doors that weren't there before. I knew the schematics by heart, but they had become lies. By the time we reached the central med bay, 3 hours had passed. Or 3 minutes. Time felt warped, compressed and stretched like space itself refused to behave. Lyra locked herself in the scan chamber. The AI wouldn't respond, but the interface still functioned. The screen showed her vitals. Normal, at first. But then, black markers started appearing beneath her skin. Not tumors, not parasites, structures. Delicate, hexagonal lattices forming under her dermis, growing, shifting. Like something was rewriting her biology from the inside. Tal screamed. He wasn't watching her, he was staring at the walls. There, etched between the steel panels, more of the same alien symbols had appeared, unburnt and fresh. But it wasn't just a language anymore. It was breathing, expanding and contracting like lungs pressed beneath metal. He pulled out his sidearm, fired into it. 5 rounds into steel and bone. The wall bled. The smell, gods, the smell of it. Not blood. Not oil. Something other. The lights flickered. The deck beneath us groaned like old wood in a storm. Then Moreau, unconscious until then, sat upright. Not slowly. Like a puppet yanked by strings. His mouth opened and a sound came out. Not his voice. Not any voice. A broadband signal. Pure transmission. Ultrasonic. I could feel it vibrating inside my skull. My vision blurred. The others fell to their knees. My eyes bled, but I didn't close them. I watched as Miro's body turned toward us, face blank, eyes milky. The signal stopped. His lips moved. And then, in perfect monotone. It has remembered its shape. You carry the vessel. Do not resist. There was no more denying it. Whatever came to Delta 6 hadn't left. It had learned us through us. And in its presence, reality wasn't fixed. It rewrote biology. Time. Matter. Even thought. It didn't knock on the door. It woke up inside it. And the real horror? We had already let it in. I had never invoked vessel protocol before. It was considered a myth, a contingency buried in black ink annexes of military doctrine spoken about in whispers among command veterans who'd seen too much beyond the rim. Vessel protocol was meant for one thing, contact with a non-terrestrial intelligence capable of psychological breach, biological reformation, or spatial corruption. The moment Moreau spoke those words, I knew the threshold had been crossed. I sealed the mebe, not for containment, for quarantine. Lyra was still inside the scan chamber, her skin now semi-translucent in patches, as though light had begun rewriting her cells with geometric code. She didn't cry anymore, didn't speak. She only stared at the ceiling, smiling like someone who had just remembered a dream they were never supposed to forget. Her vitals were stable, too stable, inhumanly perfect. That scared me more than any seizure or scream. Tal and I retreated to the server core. It was the one part of the station still resisting the decay, still holding onto original programming. That's where I first saw the logs. Deep backups the station AI had buried beneath layers of redundancy. Someone had tried to erase everything. But memory is like gravity, it leaves distortions. Shadows. I decrypted the fragments. Partial audio. Incomplete video. The last recorded logs of Delta SIX's original commander, Ellis Wren. Her voice was a rasp. Strained. She spoke of the signal, how it began subtly, through dreams and phantom reflections. How crew members stopped speaking aloud, relying on glances and unspoken understanding. How she tried to isolate departments, but the infection wasn't biological, it was intentional. A form of logic that infected the mind, an idea that took root like a seed and bloomed into obedience. She called it the whisper architecture. It wasn't just a language. It was a design, a map, a way of building thought into form. And the base was its monument. She warned, they call it the listening god. They gave it shape by trying to define it. They gave it voice by trying to understand. And once you hear it, it hears you back. I shut the logs off. Tal was gone. I hadn't heard him leave. No sound. No footsteps. Just absence. Like he'd been subtracted from the space beside me. The server room grew colder. Not temperature, pressure. Like a deep-sea trench compressing against my skull. My comms earpiece clicked alive. Tal? I whispered. But it wasn't his voice. We admire what you carry. The mind fights. The shape holds. But cracks form. I staggered back, drawing my weapon, aiming at shadows that didn't exist. My HUD flickered. A diagram flashed briefly. A spine. Not human. Curved, plated, fused with strands of circuitry and veins. Labeled in ancient glyphs and rotating as though alive. I knew then that we weren't on a base anymore. Delta 6 wasn't just listening, it had become part of what it listened to. The boundaries had collapsed. The station wasn't a shell. It was a womb. And we were inside something becoming aware. And worse, something becoming us. I should have burned the base the moment Moreau spoke. Instead, I kept searching for meaning, like some part of me believed I could still wrest control back. But control is a myth in the orbit of Delta 6. We were not its guests. We were not its prisoners. We were its material. We were the fibers it needed to stitch itself into this reality. And it was using our memories as its thread. I returned to the quarters, our quarters, or what used to be them. The layout had shifted again. Doors where there were none before. Rooms repeating in impossible sequences, as if space was rehearsing variations of itself. The same bunk, the same desk, the same datapad, copied 6 times in succession like a corrupted loop. Each copy degraded further until by the last room, the datapad was fused into the wall, its screen bleeding static into the air. I picked it up. It was warm. There was a single file on it. A recording. My voice. But I hadn't recorded it. You won't remember this part. The folds will seal once, it said. The lattice accepts nothing incomplete. Speak the full memory or be erased. I froze. My hand trembled. This wasn't a hallucination. The memory lattice, it was real. A living network woven through the structure, built not of circuits but of thoughts, of personal recollections, our dreams, our guilt, our past traumas. It was harvesting them all and using them to rewrite the base's layout in real time. Tal hadn't wandered off. He'd been remembered out of existence, his identity unraveled until there was no mind left to house him. Then I saw Lyra. She stood in the corridor ahead, barefoot, calm, smiling. The black veins had reached her eyes, forming fractal halos across her corneas. Her voice was still hers, but her words belonged to something else. The lattice is nearly whole. All it lacks is the anchor memory. That's why it keeps you. You're the carrier, Aaron. You hold the fracture point, the one memory not yet claimed. I stepped back, weapon raised, heart thundering. You saw it before all this began, she said. In your first deep space run. The rogue satellite. The encrypted signal you buried in that report. You felt it even then, didn't you? Like gravity inside your skull? That's when it chose you. And then it all connected. For years ago. A classified salvage op near the helix drift. We intercepted a probe broadcasting nonsense tones random to the ear, but when passed through frequency analysis, it formed a pattern. Not words. Blueprints. I'd ignored it. Buried it in red tape. But the pattern had stayed with me. Echoed in dreams. Drawn me toward Delta 6. My arrival wasn't accident, it was convergence. I lowered my weapon. I had brought it here. I was the breach. And now it wanted the last of me. I ran. Not from fear, but because some part of me, maybe the last part still untouched, understood that if I stayed near Lyra, I wouldn't be me much longer. The base had learned to wear her skin. She wasn't gone, not fully. But her voice had become an interface. Her body, a relay. The more it spoke through her, the less she resisted. And the lattice, it didn't steal memories violently. It seduced them. Gave you warmth, a whisper of something you missed. Then it took what it needed. Corridors bent like wet wire. The air pulsed with that same distant frequency I'd first heard during the helix drift incident, the one I had locked away in the dark of my mind. But here on Delta 6, that signal was blooming. With every step I took, the lights dimmed, not from power failure, but as if the illumination itself feared to follow. I reached Subdeck 9. It didn't exist on any schematic, but it knew I would find it. Doors opened before I touched them. The path curved inward like I was descending into something buried under the bones of the base. There were no panels, no systems, just walls that pulsed with faint red veins. The hum of the station faded completely. What remained was breath. Not mechanical. Organic. The chamber at the center was spherical. I knew before I entered that it wasn't constructed. It had grown, and suspended at its heart was Tal, or something that had once been him. Limbs stretched like roots, skin translucent, glowing with lattice markings that shifted like language struggling to decide on a shape. His mouth opened as I approached, and for a moment I saw his eyes. They were terrified. Human. Then gone. The voice returned. Not from him. From everything. The anchor resists. But it will shatter. All fractures must be resolved. The lattice remembers its design. I fell to my knees. My head burned. My thoughts weren't linear anymore. Memory fragments collided like debris, my first shuttle launch, my mother's voice calling from Earth, the scent of sterilized suits, the moment I saw the helix probe's signal. And then something new, a memory I never lived. A planet with no sky. Towers of flesh and signal. A god made of memory. It was trying to write over me. And I understood then Delta 6 was never meant to hold the entity. It was a beacon. An invitation. The crew? They didn't die. They were translated. Turned from mind to meaning. Every memory fed into the structure, until identity dissolved into architecture. The voice whispered one last thing. You are the last breach. When you forget, the gate opens. And with that, I saw the impossible. A door forming inside my chest. I stood motionless in that breathing chamber, watching the outline of the door pulse beneath my ribs. An impossible architecture growing inside me, shaped from thought, bound by memory. I wasn't bleeding. I wasn't dying. But I was being unwritten. The self I knew was slipping strand by strand, replaced by a structure I couldn't comprehend. The voice had said, when you forget, the gate opens. And now it was trying to help me forget. It began with the small things. My sister's name. My old ship's designation. The taste of coffee in 0G. Gone. Not erased, unmade. As if those memories were never part of the universe to begin with. I gripped the walls for stability, but the walls pulsed back. Guiding, inviting, recognizing. They knew me better than I knew myself. Every part of this place was coated with recollection, saturated in forgotten echoes of those who had come before. The lattice didn't just record us, it absorbed us. Once your identity reached critical mass, the base wove it into its design. Your regrets became rooms. Your dreams, corridors. And once complete, you became part of it. I stumbled out of the chamber. Somehow the base let me go. Not because I escaped, but because it wanted me to move. I was still the breach. The final piece. The unfinished puzzle it couldn't solve without consent. My freedom was bait. I knew it, but I had no choice. I returned to the bridge. It was empty now, no crew, no consoles, just a single chair facing the central viewport. And in that chair, Lyra. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. But her mind reached toward mine like a wave made of silk and needles. I felt her thoughts like static through my spine. The door you carry is the final map. They need your memory to stabilize the threshold. You were chosen not for strength, but for fracture. You are the one who never forgets until now. I drew my weapon, pointed it at her head. My hand trembled. But then I felt it. The door again. Growing. Lock by lock. It wasn't just a metaphor. Something on the other side was pushing. Trying to come through. Something massive. Patient. Ancient. It had no form. It needed ours. And I saw it, not with eyes, but with recognition. A spiral-shaped intelligence. Not a creature, not a god, but a structure. A mind that had no start or end. Its voice wasn't sound. It was gravity wrapped in thought. It didn't want to speak. It wanted to fit. Into us. Into this reality. Through me. And then Lyra finally spoke aloud. You can close it, Aaron. You only need to remember one thing. But I didn't know what. I didn't know what memory would collapse the lattice. I had so little left. Then I remembered the dream. Years ago. Before the helix signal. A dream of stars folding like paper. Of someone whispering a name in a language that felt older than time. A name I had heard in my cradle. Not from family. Not from Earth. But from it. The thing beyond the door. It had been waiting for me since birth. And now it was almost through. There are names that burn when spoken. Not from heat, but from recognition, like a mirror tilted just enough to reflect something we were never meant to see. That dream, the one I had long buried beneath protocol and silence, was no dream at all. It was the first contact. The beginning of the tether between me and the thing we could never classify. I whispered the name. Not aloud. In thought. A sequence of tones with no human syllables, no linguistic origin. Just sensation, a waveform of longing and inevitability. And as I did, the door beneath my chest stopped pulsing. It listened. For the first time, the bass stilled. No hum. No vibration. Just cold, vast silence. As if something had taken a breath so deep it swallowed the entire structure. I looked at Lyra. She was crying. Not in fear. In relief. Her voice came as a whisper. That was the key. You've said it. Now it sees you. Truly. And then she dissolved. Not in pain, just gone. Like light passing through fog. Her particles didn't fall. They joined the air. The base side. The spiral mind acknowledged the link was now complete. And I began to remember everything that wasn't mine. Visions struck me like meteor impacts. Entire galaxies consumed in stillness. Civilizations that ascended not by technology but by surrender. Minds opening like petals under invisible stars. The spiral didn't conquer. It invited. And those who accepted became more than species. They became architecture. foundations for the entity to root into spacetime. Delta 6 wasn't its first vessel, just its latest. I stood in the command observatory now, once again restructured by the lattice. Before me, through the massive viewport, hung Saturn's pale rings. But the stars beyond no longer looked familiar. They were arranged in a pattern matching the spiral glyph carved into my memories. The universe had begun to tilt. And then the message came. Not from the comms array. Not from Earth. From within. You will carry us. Through breath. Through bone. Through thought. The human lattice is strong. But it forgets. You remember. You anchor. Through you we cross. I fell to my knees. It wasn't pain. It was scale. The unbearable gravity of being known by something so vast. Something that didn't just observe, it coexisted. In every atom. Every neural impulse. The concept of self was being negotiated. Redefined. And as I convulsed under the weight of it all, the base began to shift again, not as metal but as organism. The walls unfolded. The corridors stretched into dimensions that defied mapping. Delta 6 was no longer a station. It had become a gate. And I was its frame. The voice echoed once more, now intimate, now familiar. You are the threshold. The first and last. Open. And let us dream. The name kept echoing long after my lips stopped moving. It wasn't sound anymore, it had become architecture. A shape that resonated in my bones. I wasn't thinking now. I was remembering, but not from my own life. These were not my memories, but ours. Collective. Spliced. Threads from billions pulled through time and stitched into the lattice that now wrapped Delta 6 like a chrysalis. I stood alone on the observation deck, Saturn's light flickering like a dying candle across the glass. The spiral in the stars had grown. It wasn't metaphorical. It was a structural reality now, mapped in the dark. A doorway, forming out of alignment. And I knew every second I remembered that name, the closer it came. Delta 6 had activated its final protocol. I could feel it like a pulse beneath my skin. Not mechanical, organic. The entire station had begun to convert. Walls breathing slower now, hallways reshaping into fractal curves. Consoles folding in on themselves like paper in fire. The base didn't just contain the threshold. It was the threshold, built not to protect us from what was outside, but to hold what was inside long enough to make us willing. I found myself walking again, but I didn't know where. The base was guiding me now, not as a prison, but as a cathedral. Every step felt rehearsed, a memory I hadn't yet made. I passed empty quarters, now filled with translucent shadows. Crew members I once knew, flickering like echoes, watching me without eyes. Not hostile. Not afraid. Just resigned. Then I saw the chamber. It hadn't been there before. An atrium of bone and wire, lit by nothing, yet glowing softly with a sickly blue tone. At its center, a console, or something like one, rose from the floor like a spine. It pulsed with a rhythm too perfect to be human. I approached. It spoke, not in words, but in thought echo. Final anchor initiated. Identity, Aaron Voss. Remaining ego, 27%. Proceed to dissolution. My knees buckled. I had no plan. No weapons. No protocol to reverse what had begun. I looked down at my hands.